Hello. So today I will be doing an analysis of Soto, a Character by Mary Lepore, and I'll be doing this alongside Ladies' Dressing Room by Jonathan Swift and Mary Jones's After the Smallpox. So taking a look here at the poem, we learn from the blurb that the poem is written as in octosyllabics. And the poem is written in rhyming couplet octosyllabics, each 8 syllables long, in iambic tetrameter. And just as the blurb points out, this is meant to invoke the voice of Swift in the poem. So in general, I would say that this poem is a visceral description of a man getting drunk beyond his control and the events that follow after he gets a little bit too drunk. I think the poem is important because it's a rebuttal against all of the terrible things being said about women at this time in poetry, as we'll talk about later. It portrays the reality of a gross, drunken man using the guttural terms many male poets use to describe women and the habits of women at this time. Soto, a Character, is consistent with many of the themes from other 18th century poets, as the speaker is describing a moment in time as it's happening, which was a common technique used. And the speaker also refers to nature and natural imagery, uses mock heroic and mock epic themes and techniques, and is also satirical in nature, which definitely aligns with a lot of the other poetry we've looked at in this course. Just to start with some specific examples of the devices I've mentioned, let's first take a look at lines 17 to 18. So with crimson face and winking eyes that look like woodcocks, mighty wise. These lines reference both nature imagery as it compares the man to a bird in nature, but it also reflects the satirical tone that I mentioned, because as the textbook's footnote clarifies, these birds were far from wise and had a reputation for gullibility and being easily trapped. This is an example of the speaker making a jab at the expense of an aggressively drunk fool who looks much dumber than I'm sure he imagines. Next, we'll just quickly look at line 27 here. And in line 27, the speaker uses an alliteration with greedy guts, which was a common technique, and also uses that visceral, really descriptive language saying greedy guts, which was another technique, as I have said. From lines 31 to 36, it is a moment describing the man puking from drinking too much. And it definitely exemplifies the in the moment style that the poem's in general. So just as the speaker is telling us what's happening, they update us as things happen in the moment. Stopping in line 33 to pause and say, and now, now. So this in the moment storytelling style of poetry was very common at the time, and it describes everything happens as it happens. This part of the poem also echoes the mock epic or mock heroic themes, as it describes a man throwing up with such serious and grandeur language that it evokes the power of wind, even though they're just boozy hiccups. And then puke becomes a huge river in lines 36. And the bile is described with incessant flows from frothy tide from mouth to nose. And when it covers the floor with that, I just think that the language that they use with phlegm and frothy definitely evokes that Swiftian style of really gross words, really gross imagery. And finally, in these last passages, the speaker mentions the brave tales of Homer's Iliad, providing a satirical contrast yet again to the pathetic sight that they have already described, as if the great wave of his alcoholic spew actually compares to the battles of Achilles in the Greek classic against the river. This continues the mock heroic theme that also solidifies Lepore as similar to other poets by mentioning this Greek text, as it was a common thing to do. All in all, I think this poem does a great job painting a descriptive picture of a disgusting, loud, bellowing, red-faced drunk man in an act of defiance against the cruel things being said of women by other satirical poems at the time. Speaking of, let's contextualize this poem with the man himself, Jonathan Swift. So Ladies' Dressing Room really needs no introduction, as it's one of Swift's most famous/infamous poems. And like Lepore's poem, which was in iambic tetrameter, this poem is as well. However, he utilizes feminine rhymes, as we talked about in class, like in the first 4 lines here, when he says lesson, dressin, issues, tissues. And these feminine rhymes could have been used to further demean the already heavily misogynistic things that he writes about in this poem. This further strengthens my views on Lepore using Soto to combat the words of Swift and others. Moving on to some other things I have underlined in this poem, let's take a look at lines 27 and 33. Here alum flower to stop the steams, here gallipots and vials place. The use of the word here in the beginning of both lines, again invokes that in the moment style of descriptive poetry and storytelling that was commonly used, like in Soto, a character. Oh, right. And then the next lines, 45 and 46, uses alliteration and listing, just like Soto, a character does. But let's take a closer look. So while Swift describes the belongings of a woman as begummed, bemattered, and beslimed, with her dirt, sweat, and earwax grimed, Lepore takes a stand against this and calls out a man for his greedy guts and his insatiable need for drink and his wind, ale, and phlegm. This direct comparison shows how well situated Soto, a character, is in the world of 18th century literature. Moving on to the last lines of Swift's poem, I've underlined the beginning of his comparison to Celia's chamber pot alongside the Greek legend of Zeus and Pandora's box. Similar to Lepore's mention of the Iliad in her own poem, as we already know, this reminds us that Swift's poems often take on a mock epic and heavily satirical tone, just like Soto, a character, does by comparing vomit to the Iliad and comparing excrement to Pandora's box. Okay, moving on to the last poem here, we are looking at Mary Jones's After the Smallpox. Like Lepore's poem, which was also inspired by Swift, just like this one, as the textbook alludes to. This poem is also written in octosyllabic couplets. However, unlike both Swift and Lepore, this poem has a much more serious, sincere, and non-satirical tone to it. Jones describes how it feels to know that your worth as a woman is based on your outward appearances, and instead she insists that you must look at one's heart instead of only focusing on her face. While slightly different in tone, this poem also makes an obvious stand against the commodification and the belittling of women for their physical attributes, just like Soto, a character, does by satirizing a man for his physical attributes as well. We can still see how Soto, a character, can be contextualized using this poem. Like in the beginning lines here, Jones describes all the opportunities men have in the market, making things with threads and tapes, shoemakers making boots, while women are only there to be consumed for their looks. This is just like the theme that Lepore emphasizes in her poem. And then further, in line 22, Jones directly mentions Stella as an example of someone who has to be like commodified, just like other women were at this time. And as the textbook states, the use of the name Stella specifically is likely a callback to Swift because of his famous Stella poems. Both this and Lepore's poem are poetic rebuttals against the demeaning way women were often portrayed by poets like Swift, using his own style to further demonstrate their frustrations. I hope you enjoyed and have a great rest of your break. Thank you so much for the semester and have a great day. Thank you.